Ben Burgis, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you.
One approach of the left, and especially in the US, I think, when it comes to reactionary right-wing ideas and the people who hold them, is to avoid them, avoid giving them a platform, avoid talking with them, avoid engaging with them. And the argument is you're only going to end up propagating their ideas.
Right.
You're someone who takes very much the opposite view on this, and even though your politics are very much on the left, you choose to go head-to-head with people whose views, to put it mildly, you disagree with.
Right.
What do you think is the value of that kind of engagement, and what are you hoping to achieve with it?
Sure. So I think the impulse to, not give people platforms, I think both shows a kind of disturbing lack of confidence in our own ideas, and also just doesn't really make sense to me mathematically. It seems like oftentimes we're talking about people who already have much larger platforms, than we do. And so the idea that if you just sort of studiously ignore them and not give them the magical aura of your presence, that'll decrease their influence doesn't really make sense. I think it makes a lot more sense to go out there and present your ideas to people who might not otherwise be exposed to them, especially because we're in an incredibly fractured media landscape where oftentimes this is the only way you can ever talk to anybody else's audience.
And what do you have to achieve when you argue with these people? I mean,
Sure.
I imagine you don't think you're going to change their mind necessarily. Is the hope that people watching it that aren't really already part of the tribal divisions are going to somehow take something away from it?
Yeah, I mean, the goal is never to convince the other person on the stage or the person in the other half of the YouTube split screen or whatever, because that's probably not going to happen. People whose personal and professional identities are wrapped up in promoting their point of view do sometimes change their mind, but it's an incredibly slow process. At that point, it's almost like experiencing a religious conversion, and it's probably not going to happen as a result of one conversation. And the goal isn't even to reach their most hardcore fans for the reasons you kind of hinted at in that question. That's also probably not a realistic goal, but any audience of any size whatsoever is composed of lots of different groups of people. And so you want to reach whoever's persuadable in that audience. That could be curious fence sitters, that could be people who, you're debating Charlie Kirk, there could be people who, kind of like what he's saying and are willing to give him a sympathetic hearing but aren't really married to these ideas yet. It could be people who used to be hardcore fans, but you catch them at exactly the right time, in the arc when they're open to something else.
YouTube has been known as this kind of like radicalizing platform. Do you think it also acts now as a kind of the opposite? Does it de-radicalize people that already have sort of views that are quite far out there?
Yeah, it can. I think that certainly anecdotally, I hear from people all the time who have moved to the left as a result of things that they've watched on YouTube that they think that's played a role. So it certainly can. I mean, I have all sorts of issues with the way that those platforms work, and if I could somehow magically get my way, I think that there just wouldn't be. I'm kind of an algorithm abolitionist. I think there just wouldn't be recommended videos. You'd have to search for things. But given that it is what it is, I think it's a space that it's not helpful to concede to your ideological opponents.
You are a defender of free speech and a critic of those who argue that platforms like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook should regulate speech online, ban certain forms of misinformation, ban certain forms of conspiracy theorizing. Do you think the left is on the wrong side of the argument when it comes to free speech, especially with online platforms?
Yeah, I think many progressives, even many people with seriously left-wing views, who end up sort of tailing the liberal end of the culture wars on this issue, are incredibly short-sighted about this. So even though what they would call misinformation, which is a word I kind of hate because I think lying is a perfectly good word. Just believing dumb things is a perfectly understandable concept, but misinformation is this sort of unhelpful pseudo-technical term that sounds like it identifies something very clear, but My problem with it, the reason I think it's so short-sighted, is that every political argument is to some extent an argument about the facts. That people who want to raise the minimum wage and people who don't disagree about whether that's going to lead to more unemployment. People who want to escalate the conflict with Russia are less likely to think that that's going to lead to the threat of World War III than people who don't, et cetera, et cetera. That's always going to be true. Like, there's no political argument that's only an argument about values and not at all an argument about facts. So both sides will always, from their perspective, think the other is guilty of misinformation, whatever that means. And so the question is, as always with free speech, I think, who gets to decide, right? Who gets to decide what's true and what's misinformation? And I don't really trust any institution, with that power, even if YouTube and Spotify and Twitter were run by some committee that, represented working class interests, I still wouldn't trust them. But I particularly don't trust them because they're actually owned by massive profitable corporations that have every incentive to oppose the platform of the serious left. They don't want to give up their money, and who have every incentive to stay on the right side of the national security state. So, one way of kind of bringing all these threads together is to ask, okay, if social media as we know it had existed in 2002, and they had strict policies against misinformation, who would be more likely to be booted for misinformation? People who agreed with George Bush, Tony Blair, and the New York Times there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or people who didn't?
Around the time that Elon Musk was pretending he was going to buy Twitter, we don't know whether he's actually going to do it. You wrote an article saying, despite the fact that he has this kind of position of absolute free speech, that wouldn't really help free speech. Why did you think that?
Yeah, so I think it's possible that if Elon Musk actually did go ahead with the purchase, I think it's entirely possible that there would be moderation policies there, for better or for worse. I doubt that he would do exactly what he was saying, but I think it's entirely possible the policies would change in a direction I would like. But the point I was making in that article is that, one, I don't particularly trust him on this. I think if you look at his own history of union busting, if you look at his own history of being very hair-trigger about suing people for libel, I don't particularly believe that he would, maybe he would surprise me, but I would be very unsurprised if he wasn't quite good on his word on free speech policies on Twitter. But that's, I could be wrong about that. The larger point, the more important point to my mind, is that it's kind of absurd that you should have to hope that some benevolent rich person is going to buy the digital public square and that they're going to allow lots of free speech there. I mean, as if in actual literal public squares we lived in some sort of, libertarian dystopia where those were privately owned, and so you could only hold a public protest march if the particular sidewalk you were, marching down happened to be owned by a free speech billionaire instead of an anti-free speech billionaire. That seems like a very short-sighted solution to me. So, it might have good results, but I don't think we should have to count on that. I think we'd be much better off having democratically accountable institutions run these platforms.
You mentioned earlier that political disagreement isn't just about values, it's also about facts. Is disagreement about the facts increasing, or was this always a part of politics and we've just somehow cottoned on to the fact that that's the case?
I think it's always been part of politics. I think it might be maybe like a little bit more obvious or disturbing in some ways now than it was like in 2002, for example. So I think that now there's just a different problem with media. That the problem with media in 2002 was more or less all the stuff that like Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman were talking about in the 80s, manufacturing consent. That certain, that there was this, mainstream media that was incredibly powerful that excluded voices that shouldn't be excluded and was too credulous about government claims and things like that. All entirely correct criticisms, but that's just not the problem that we have now, right? The problem we have now is that traditional media has economically collapsed. It's incredibly fractured. It's in many ways returned to its roots, that we sort of had this idea of a politically neutral media as a sort of mid-20th century invention, and we're reverted to an older form of media that's very fractured, where the economic incentive given that 5% as many people are watching Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson or whoever has watched, say, Walter Cronkite back when. The economic incentive is to relentlessly pander to whatever audience you have left, which means that there's a lot of incentive for reporting even the wisp of the rumor of something that fits with your preferred narratives, and a lot of disincentives for correcting it when you find out that it's not true. So I think that certain kinds of arguments about facts are more frustrated now, probably, than they were 20 years ago. But I also don't think there was ever a time when arguments about facts played no role in political arguments. I think that's always going to be there.
Are culture wars based on a disagreement also about facts, or are those really truly only about values?
Yeah, I don't think they're only about values. I think that, in fact, very oftentimes culture war spats are fueled by people having very different impressions of facts, that there'll be some high-profile trial that you'll get completely parallel universes of people's perceptions of what's going on in them. They'll get very mad at each other about this. And then at the end of the day, there is no, in terms of policy, there's no there. Random trials don't set legally binding precedents, right? What happens with, I don't know, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard only affects Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, literally, and nobody else, but people still fight about this. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's this sort of strange symbolic pseudo-politics, right? Politics, as I would understand it, is about what the laws are, how material resources are distributed, and none of that is actually at stake in any of this. I mean, I think in a strange way, because there's so much information at everybody's fingertips all the time, and so much chance to sort of signal your allegiances, through your media preferences, but also most ordinary people are largely disempowered in terms of institutional things that affect their lives. The combination of all of this is that everything is political, but none of it actually matters very much.
Is there a danger of dismissing culture or politics as irrelevant, as kind of politically frivolous, as pseudo-politics, when, especially in the US, some of the key culture war issues on things like abortion and gun control really do end up affecting sort of how people's lives are run?
Yeah, so I'd make a distinction between social policy and culture, right? So I think that, battles that are fought literally over what the laws are, whether you're allowed to get an abortion, whether you're allowed to, sell 18-year-olds AR-15s, are not the same thing as fighting about cultural sensibilities, which would be probably culture war, properly speaking, although they're fought as proxies for the culture war. So I think that, for example, it's the reason why Republicans in Florida passed the law against teaching anything that had anything to do with sexual identity or sexual orientation in early grades of school. Wasn't that they'd received a bunch of reports about this happening, and they decided that something had to be done about it. It was for the sake of scoring points about their cultural sensibilities. But sure, once you do that, then you have a real issue, and that could be very bad. You could imagine all sorts of ways in which, under that law, that example, that teachers could get fired for doing all sorts of innocuous things, and it's an attack on public education, and that does need to be fought about. But even there, I would say that recognizing that a lot of these social policy battles are often fought as proxies for the culture war should impact how we think about them, which is not to say that the left can be neutral on them. I mean, there are issues of principle here. But I think it does impact how you think about issues of emphasis, because battles over cultural sensibilities do tend to polarize people in a much more evenly split way, whereas battles about distribution of material resources at least have the potential to build much larger majority coalitions. So without giving anything up on the substance of it, right? That, again, there are issues of principle. If you believe women have the right to control their own bodies, you have to oppose, attempts to roll back abortion rights. But I think strategically it can still make a lot of sense to try to focus as much as possible on the kinds of battles where I think the left's message is going to be most compelling to the most people.
And how do we move the agenda away from the kind of cultural issues that just divide people so tribally and onto the kind of economic agenda?
One part of that specifically on the electoral front is that you actually do have to give people something that they can get excited about the material issues. I think it's a little much to hope that if you're 6% better than the opposition on the material issues, that people will get more excited about that than they do about cultural tribalism. But I also think that not all of the answer is electoral. I think that a lot of it has to take place in the workplace. As we're having this conversation, there have been several hundred Starbucks stores in the United States that have unionization efforts going on at them right now. There was just the first Amazon warehouse that was unionized. And this is the kind of thing, because it affects people's interests at the most immediate visceral level, that am I going to get paid more? Is it going to be easier to take time off, to spend with my family? I think there's much greater potential for winning over people whose cultural sensibilities might put them at odds with the left. In that first ever Amazon warehouse that was unionized, even though the main organizer, Chris Smalls, is a black radical leftist, he's given credit to this Amazon warehouse worker who refers to his Uncle Pat, who's an Italian-American Trump voter in Staten Island, who signed up several hundred people for the union, because even if you like Trump because he triggers the libs, you might still like to have more bathroom breaks and be paid more money.
Among other things, you're a philosophy professor. Is there room for philosophy in contemporary politics, or is that too idealistic and naive to believe?
I think you need to fire on both levels. So I think that it's, I'm under no illusions that 99% of political persuasion is going to take place at the level of well worked out intellectual arguments. You have to have a version of that trickles down to the point of punchy, easily communicated things. But I actually also think it's useful to have a version of it that is well worked out. That if you're trying to convince a lot of different people who are going to ask different kinds of questions and be engaged with different kinds of arguments, I think it's useful to have some people who do each. Some people who do both. I think that you probably, don't get me wrong, I think that I think the left probably needs more union organizers than philosophy professors, but I don't think it's bad to have a few philosophy professors.
Left-wing politics is supposed to be sort of forward-looking, but they often have this kind of whiff of the past, ideas from the 19th century, economic ideas from the 1960s and the 1970s, and that in some ways allows people to dismiss them as kind of irrelevant to the 21st century, caught in the past, trying to resurrect an economic world and reality that no longer exists. So what's your vision for left-wing politics of the future that sort of is a genuine orientation towards the future, not the past?
Yeah, I think that, I think that for most of the couple thousand years between the end of the Roman Republic and the French Revolution, anybody who was talking about a republican form of government, was talking about things that hadn't existed for many centuries. Surely if the mid to late 19th century had gone, had gone a different way, and the sort of world that Metternich presided over, was more or less the one we were still in, then say, we tried some of this democracy stuff in the early 19th century, it didn't go anywhere. Why are you still stuck in that? You should be talking about some slightly different form of monarchy, because that would be exciting and new and progressive. I think that the left-right distinction that I care about is about how equal, a society, how fair a society you're living in, and to the extent that the society you're living in has gone in the right direction, then going even further, will seem progressive in that chronological sense. To the extent that it's gone in the wrong direction, as it has in the last several decades of neoliberalism, then it's going to seem backward looking. But I don't really care about forward or backward. I care about more egalitarian or less.
Ben Burgis, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
more debates, talks, and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.